Snow fell thick across the Ardennes in December 1944, the kind that swallowed sound and turned battlefields into frozen tombs. It clung to trees and rifles, to helmets and open eyes, muffling everything except the dull heartbeat of artillery far beyond the hills. The Battle of the Bulge had erupted Hitler's last desperate thrust to split the Allied lines, retake Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace. What had been a quiet sector only days earlier was now a storm of steel and confusion. Corporal James Harland of the British 6th Airborne had been sent to reinforce the American line near Manhay, linking with the 101st Airborne Division under General Taylor. He had fought in Normandy, had jumped into the darkness over Caen, and thought he had seen the worst of it. He was wrong. The Ardennes was something else entirely, cold, endless, merciless. Beside him trudged Corporal Michael Turner, a Tennessee farm boy turned paratrooper. Turner was younger by 4 years, broad-shouldered and restless, the kind of soldier who spoke of baseball between firefights. Their platoons had been mauled during the night bombardment of December 20th. When the fog lifted, their companies were pulled back toward Werbemont, leaving the two corporals stranded behind enemy lines. Harlan tested his radio. It was dead, its casing cracked by a blast. Turner cursed softly and kicked snow over the shattered equipment. The forest around them was silent except for the groaning of distant trees under ice. Somewhere out there, Panzer engines rumbled like thunder. "Which way, British?" Turner asked, voice muffled by his scarf. Harlan checked his compass. "Southwest, Bastogne. If the 101st is still holding, we'll find your lot there." Turner nodded. "And yours?" "Mine are somewhere north of the line. Doesn't matter now. We keep moving." They started through the drifts, boots crunching over frozen needles. The day never seemed to brighten, only shades of gray and white. Along the trail they passed a burnt truck. Its tires melted into the ice. A body lay half buried beside it, hands curled as if reaching for warmth. Turner bent and pulled a half-frozen map from the man's coat. "La Roche-en-Ardennes west of here," he said. "If we follow the river, we might skirt the Krauts." Harlan nodded, though he knew maps meant little now. Roads were gone, villages destroyed, bridges blown. The 2nd Panzer Division held the main routes. The 12th SS Hitlerjugend prowled the woods. Every path south meant danger, yet standing still was death too. By dusk, they reached a ridge overlooking Manhay. Smoke rose from chimneys and wreckage alike. German vehicles lined the main road, engines idling, men shouting in clipped voices. Through the falling snow, headlights flickered like ghosts. Harlan studied them through his field glasses, the black crosses of the Wehrmacht clear against white armor. Turner whispered, "Could take that sentry easy." "Waste of a bullet," Harlan muttered. "We move after dark." When the sun disappeared, they crawled down into the ditches. Mud and ice soaked their knees. A panzer crew smoked by a half-track, laughter cutting through the wind. Turner's finger rested on the trigger, but Harlan's hand pressed his arm down. Inch by inch, they slipped past the line of trucks until the voices faded behind them. They moved west toward La Roche-en-Ardennes. The forest was their shield and prison both. At times they could hear artillery from Bastogne, the dull thud echoing through the valleys. Turner tried to talk, but Harlan preferred silence. He had learned in Normandy that too much talking drew ghosts. By the 2nd day, they reached the outskirts of La Roche. The town was ruined, its bridge gone, its houses shells of stone. The Luftwaffe had bombed it days before to clear the way for the German advance. Smoke still hung in the air. They entered what remained of a bakery, stepping over shards of glass. The smell of burnt flour mixed with ash. Turner picked up a small wooden toy soldier from the rubble, a tiny figure with a red cap, half charred. "Some kid's hero," he said quietly. He slipped it into his pocket. Harlan found a few tins of food in a cabinet, blackened but intact. He split them open with his bayonet. "Beans," he said. "Could be worse." They ate cold, staring at the walls. Outside, the wind rose, whistling through the holes in the roof. Turner leaned back and sighed. "My brother's somewhere in Bastonia," he said. "Charlie, last letter said he was with Easy Company. Haven't heard since the push started. He'll be holding," Harlan said. "Your lot don't give up easy." That night they camped in the ruins of a cafe. The ceiling had caved in and snow drifted through the cracks. Turner could not sleep. He kept muttering about Bastonia, about how the Americans had sworn not to surrender. Harlan said little. He thought of London, of his wife's photograph folded in his pocket, of a war that never seemed to end. Then came the sound of engines again, closer this time. Tanks, voices, German. The two men crept to the cellar, rifles ready. Above them, boots thudded on the floorboards. Someone shouted orders. Another man laughed. A door opened, then slammed. One of the soldiers relieved himself against the wall, the stench drifting down. Turner's grip tightened on his rifle. Harlan shook his head slowly. The noise moved away. Minutes later, only silence remained. Turner let out a shaky laugh. "Bloody hell," he whispered. "Thought that was it." Harlan smiled faintly. "Still breathing, aren't we?" When dawn came, they slipped out the back and moved on. Their breath smoked in the cold. The road south was littered with debris helmets, shattered crates, frozen corpses. Crows circled overhead, black against the gray sky. They followed a sign toward Baraque de Fraiture. Harlan knew of it, an American artillery position that had stood against Piper's SS tanks for 3 days before being overrun. When they reached it, all that remained were charred guns and twisted bodies. Snow had begun to bury the dead, leaving only boots and helmets sticking out like grave markers. Turner stopped and stared. "Could have been us," he murmured. Harlan nodded. "Maybe we'll be, if we don't move." They scavenged ammunition from a frozen body and pressed onward. Hunger gnawed at them. They melted snow in their helmets for water. The forest closed around them, dark and endless. Each step felt heavier than the last. Near Odain, they met a German patrol, 5 men moving single file along the ridge. Harlan spotted them first. "Down!" he hissed. They dropped behind a fallen tree. The Germans talked casually, unaware. When one stopped to light a cigarette, Harlan fired. The crack of rifles shattered the quiet. 2 Germans fell, the rest scattered. Bullets tore through branches. Turner returned fire until his rifle jammed. He cursed and ducked as splinters flew. A round grazed his arm, blood darkening the snow. Harlan dragged him behind a log. They waited, hearts pounding, until the forest fell silent again. Turner winced. "Arm's gone numb." "Good," Harlan said. "Means you'll keep it." He bandaged the wound with a strip from his own sleeve, then helped Turner to his feet. "Keep moving," he said. "We're close to Huffeleis." The road curved through deep forest. Hours passed. Turner stumbled often, his face pale from blood loss. Harlan half carried him until they saw rooftops ahead. The bridge over the Ourthe had been destroyed, the river below a ruined town, quiet beneath the snow. Huffeleis W was frozen solid. Houses stood in ruin, shells blasted by artillery. Not a soul moved. They crossed cautiously, rifles raised. Somewhere a dog barked once, then went silent. They searched the wreckage of a jeep near the church. Inside the glove box, Turner found a chocolate bar, white with frost. He smiled weakly. Miracle. They shared it, breaking the bar in half. For a moment, it tasted like hope. Then came footsteps. From behind a collapsed wall, a German soldier emerged, young, maybe 16. His rifle trembled in his hands. His eyes were wide with fear. Turner raised his hands. "Easy, kid." The boy shouted something in German, voice cracking. Harlan whispered, "Don't!" The rifle went off. The bullet grazed Harlan's shoulder. Turner fired once, reflexively. The boy fell back into the snow, eyes still open. Neither man spoke. Harlan clutched his shoulder, blood seeping through his coat. Turner knelt beside the body. "He was just a kid," he said softly. Harlan said nothing. Together they covered the boy with snow until he disappeared. Night fell again. The cold deepened. They found a barn on the edge of Bertogne and crawled inside. The wind screamed through the boards. Harlan's wound burned. Turner shivered uncontrollably. In the corner of the barn lay a pile of junk, broken tools, wires, and a small German field radio, cracked but intact. Turner stared at it for a long moment, then dragged it closer. "If this thing still talks, maybe someone will hear us." He worked for hours, fingers stiff, stripping wires, adjusting knobs. Static hissed through the dark. Harlan dozed in and out, dreaming of trains and London lights. Then Turner shouted, "I've got something!" Through the noise came faint English voices, Allied code, garbled but real. Harlan crawled over, pressing the transmitter. "This is Corporal James Harlan, British 6th Airborne, with Corporal Michael Turner, U.S. 101. We're behind enemy lines near Bertogne. Request extraction. Over static." Then, barely audible, "Copy that, Corporal. Stay put. Rescue patrol en route." Harlan closed his eyes. For the first time in days, he allowed himself to believe. Morning came gray and merciless. The wind had turned sharper, the kind that burned the lungs with every breath. Snow drifted through cracks in the barn roof and landed on Harlan's face, waking him. His shoulder throbbed from the wound, stiff with dried blood. Across from him, Turner was already awake, crouched over the German field radio, ear pressed to the receiver. "Any word?" Harlan asked, voice hoarse. Turner shook his head. "Just static. Might have been a fluke last night." "Try again," Harlan said, pulling himself up. "We can't count on luck twice." Turner adjusted the dials, careful and patient. The signal sputtered bursts of white noise, then silence. Harlan knew the set's range was short. If the message had reached anyone, they'd need time to plan a rescue. Time they didn't have. Outside, engines groaned faintly in the valley below. The Germans were still pushing west. Somewhere beyond those ridges lay Bastogne encircled, frozen, but still holding. Harlan leaned against the wall, staring at the thin light creeping through the boards. "We can't stay here. Patrols'll sweep this place by nightfall." Turner packed the radio in his rucksack. "Then where?" "West," Harlan said. "We'll move toward Tillet. If the rescue comes, they'll look along the main road." They left the barn before dawn. The forest was silent, every branch glazed with frost. As they trudged downhill, Harlan could see the scars of battle, burnt half-tracks, dead horses, broken sleds scattered like bones. The German advance had stalled after Christmas, but no one had told the men still dying in the snow. They crossed the Orthe River, where the ice was thickest. Turner went first, boots creaking over the frozen sheet. In the middle, the ice groaned loudly. Harlan froze, heart pounding. A crack split the air, spidering beneath their feet. They ran for the far bank, slipping and sliding until they threw themselves onto solid ground, panting. Turner laughed breathlessly. "Would have been a hell of a way to go." Harlan only nodded. "Next time we find a bridge." By midday, they reached Tillet, or what was left of it. The town had been contested for days, changing hands between the U.S. 35th Infantry and the German Panzer Lehr Division. The church steeple was gone, blasted clean off. Houses leaned at odd angles, smoke rising from the rubble. The air smelled of cordite and decay. From the north came the distant clatter of gunfire. Turner squinted toward it. "That's a .30 caliber fire. Ours." "Could be," Harlan said. "Could also be a trap." They crawled through the ruins toward the sound. Every shadow seemed to move, every shape in the snow a potential sniper. They passed a frozen cow half buried near a wrecked cart, its eyes glazed with ice. The absurdity of it made Turner grin. "The whole world's gone mad," he muttered. At the edge of town, they found 3 bodies, 2 Americans and a German, locked together in death, rifles still in hand. Harlan knelt beside one of the Americans, pulling a patch from his sleeve. 35th Infantry Division. The man's pack held a blood-stained notebook, inside written in pencil, "Holding Tillet as long as we can." Reinforcements expected from Bastogne, Harlan closed the book gently. "They never came," he said. They moved on, skirting the edge of the main road. A few hundred meters ahead, Turner spotted movement on a German half-track, men unloading crates. The corporals ducked behind a stone wall. Through a crack, Harlan counted 7 soldiers. One carried an MG-42, another wore an officer's cap. "We could flank them," Turner whispered. "Take their truck." Harlan thought it through. Risky, but the truck might get them closer to Allied lines faster than marching. He nodded once. "We wait for them to spread out." Minutes ticked by. Snow fell heavier, muting everything. When 2 Germans wandered toward the ruins opposite them, Turner signaled. Harlan threw a stone down the alley. Metal clanged. The soldiers turned curious. Turner rose and fired twice, both shots clean. The others shouted, diving for cover. Gunfire erupted. The MG-42 barked, chewing chunks from the wall. Harlan returned fire, aiming low. Turner lobbed a grenade he'd scavenged days earlier. It bounced once and exploded beneath the truck, flipping it on its side in a burst of smoke. When the noise died, only 1 German was left crawling, screaming. Harlan approached carefully, rifle ready. The man was bleeding badly, clutching his leg. Harlan lowered his weapon. "Where are your lines?" he demanded in German. The soldier stared up, terrified. "Hufeleis, north. SS is still there. You won't pass." Harlan nodded grimly. "We'll see." He motioned Turner forward. They searched the wreckage for supplies, canned food, bandages, ammunition. Turner found a folded map in the officer's coat pocket marked with red lines and arrows. "This is their push line," he said. "Shows where they're digging in." Harlan studied it. "Then we move south. If we can reach Bastogne's outer perimeter, they'll hear us on the radio." As dusk fell, the forest swallowed them again. The snow turned blue in the fading light. They marched until Turner's wound reopened, soaking through his sleeve. He insisted he could keep going, but Harlan saw the tremor in his hand. They found shelter in a small chapel outside Champs, a stone ruin, roof half gone. Inside, candles still burned before the altar, long melted to stubs. Harlan wrapped Turner's arm tighter, then lit a scrap of wood in the fireplace. The small flame cast long shadows on the walls. Turner stared into it, eyes glassy with exhaustion. "You think anyone'll find us?" he asked. "Someone will," Harlan said quietly. "We sent the call." "The Yanks don't abandon their own," Turner smiled faintly. "That's what my brother always said." Outside, the night deepened. Snow drifted in through the broken roof, whispering across the stone floor. Harlan tried to sleep but couldn't. Every creak of wood, every gust of wind sounded like boots on snow. He gripped his rifle and waited for morning. Dawn came pale and bitter. The wind had eased, leaving the forest eerily still. Harlan woke to find Turner gone. Panic shot through him until he saw footprints leading outside. Turner stood a few yards away, staring east. Smoke rose faintly beyond the trees. "Look," he said, "that's Bastogne." Harlan followed his gaze. Far in the distance, beyond rolling hills, columns of dark smoke marked the besieged town. The sight filled him with both hope and dread. Between them and that smoke lay miles of German-held forest. "Let's move," he said. They descended through the pines, sticking to shadows. Twice they heard trucks on nearby roads, German voices shouting. Once, they came across a farmhouse still intact. Inside, an old Belgian woman sat by the fire, knitting silently. She looked up as they entered, eyes wide with fear. "Americans?" she whispered. Harlan nodded. Yes. Allies." She gestured for them to sit, poured them thin soup from a pot. Turner wolfed it down gratefully. The woman spoke little English, but enough to say, "Germans come every day. You go fast." Before they left, she pressed a small wooden cross into Harlan's hand. "Pour la chance," she said softly. "For luck." He thanked her and tucked it into his pocket beside his wife's photo. By late afternoon, artillery thunder rolled across the valleys. The Bastogne pocket was still under siege. They could see tracer fire streaking through the gray sky. Turner's face tightened with determination. "My brother's in there. We gotta make it." Harlan gripped his shoulder. "Then we will." They moved into the last stretch of forest before the American line. But the Germans were thick here, patrols sweeping for infiltrators. Near the village of Neffa, they ran straight into one. A voice barked, "Halt!" 3 soldiers emerged from the trees, rifles aimed. Turner dove behind a stump and fired. The forest erupted in chaos, rifle cracks, shouts, branches snapping. Harlan rolled into a ditch, returning fire. One German fell, another shouted for reinforcements. Then, from deeper in the woods, came the unmistakable growl of a machine gun. "They've got an MG nest," Turner yelled. Bullets shredded bark above their heads. Harlan crawled through the snow, pulling a grenade from his belt. He pulled the pin with his teeth and lobbed it toward the gunner. A muffled boom followed, then silence. When the smoke cleared, 2 Germans lay dead. The third had fled. Turner limped toward the wrecked gun, panting. "That'll buy us some time." Harlan nodded, scanning the trees. In the distance, through the drifting snow, he thought he saw movement, shapes advancing, slow and deliberate. "Not Germans," he whispered. "Americans." They waited, hearts pounding. Then came the sound that lifted them both, the click of English words shouted through the cold. "Hold your fire. Identify yourselves." Turner stood and waved his rifle. "Corporal Turner, 101st. We're friendly." A squad of paratroopers emerged from the trees, helmets marked with spade insignias. "Easy Company, 506. The leader approached cautiously. "Jesus, you boys look like ghosts," he said. "We thought everyone east of Neff was dead." "Almost were," Harlan said, voice trembling with relief. "Got cut off near Manhay." The sergeant grinned. "You're lucky." "We've got orders to pull stragglers back to Bastogne perimeter." "You're coming with us." Turner laughed, half crying. "Finally." As they followed the squad through the woods, artillery thunder grew louder. Bastogne loomed ahead, surrounded by smoke and defiance. The road was lined with wrecked tanks and frozen bodies, American and German alike. The siege was still raging, but the line was holding. For the first time in 10 days, Harlan felt the weight lift from his chest. They weren't alone anymore. The road to Bastogne was nothing but churned snow and death. Harlan walked at the tail of the column, boots crunching through frozen slush. The sky was low and gray, the air filled with distant artillery that rolled like thunder over the hills. Turner limped beside him, pale but smiling alive, if barely. Around them, paratroopers of the 101st moved in silence, faces hard with exhaustion. They reached the outskirts of the town just before dusk. Smoke hung over the rooftops. Every building bore the scars of shells. Trucks burned in the streets, their engines frozen solid. A soldier at a checkpoint waved them through, muttering, "Welcome to Bastogne, gentlemen. Home, sweet hell." Inside the perimeter, the scene was grim. Medics carried stretchers through the snow. Chaplains knelt beside the dying, whispering prayers. Tanks sat dug in at crossroads, their barrels aimed east. The men looked gaunt, wrapped in blankets and rags. Supplies were thin, morale thinner, but they still held the line. A major from the 327th Glider Infantry took their names. Cut off since Manhay, he said, raising an eyebrow. Harlan nodded. Survived by chance and stubbornness. The major gave a tired smile. That's about all that's left of us, Corporal. They were assigned to the northern defense sector, near Foy. Turner's arm was bandaged again by a medic who had more blood than gauze on his hands. You should be in a hospital, he muttered. Turner just grinned. Ain't leaving till this is over. That night, Harland and Turner shared a dugout with 3 other men from the 101st. The air stank of oil and sweat. Frost crawled across the walls. Someone passed around a tin of coffee that tasted of smoke. Outside, artillery boomed constantly, German 80s pounding the town. Supply planes due tomorrow, one of the paratroopers said. If the weather clears, Harlan glanced upward. And if they don't, then we freeze and fight, the man replied. No one laughed. By midnight, the bombardment intensified. The ground shook. Shards of wood fell from the ceiling. Turner clutched his rifle, knuckles white. Feels like they know exactly where we are. They always do, Harlan said. The bastards can smell fear. In the lull between explosions, Harlan thought of home in London before the war. His wife's handwriting on the letters he kept folded in his breast pocket. He wondered if she still believed he was alive. At dawn, the cold was crueler than ever. The men crawled out to relieve the sentries. The forest beyond Foy was shrouded in fog, every tree like a shadow waiting to move. Somewhere in that mist, the Germans were massing again. A runner arrived, breathless, from headquarters. Armored attack expected from Noville sector. Be ready, Harlan checked his weapon, frost biting at his fingers. Turner adjusted the sling on his injured arm, refusing to rest. If tanks roll in, we hit their tracks first, he said. You've done this before? Once. Didn't end well, Turner grinned faintly. Let's hope luck's changed. The first shells came at noon, whistling overhead, tearing through treetops. The line erupted in noise and fire. Sherman tanks returned fire, their guns flashing orange through the snow. Harland and Turner manned a foxhole, rifles ready. German infantry advanced behind the armor, black shapes darting between trees. Hold till they break the flank, someone shouted. Harland fired, hit one man square in the chest. Turner reloaded with his good hand, firing short bursts. The air was thick with smoke and screams. A tank exploded 30 yards away, showering them with dirt and metal. The Germans pressed hard, shouting, their silhouettes moving closer. Turner threw his last grenade. It rolled beneath a machine gun nest and blasted it apart. Then the push slowed. Allied mortars answered from the town, pounding the tree line until the attackers scattered. When silence returned, the snow was red. Turner sat back, breathing hard. Still standing, he muttered. Barely, Harlan replied. He looked around, half the foxholes empty. The cost of holding Bastogne was measured in bodies. For 3 more days they endured. The siege dragged on, hunger gnawing at everyone. Food rations were halved, ammunition rationed even tighter. Planes finally broke through the clouds on the 23rd, C-47s dropping supplies by parachute. Men cheered like children as crates drifted down. Harlan caught one with a blanket. Inside were bandages, ammo, and chocolate. He tossed the chocolate to Turner. Merry bloody Christmas, Turner laughed weakly. Best one I've had in years. The following morning, a chaplain held a small service near the Bastogne church. Snow fell softly as he spoke of faith and endurance. Harlan stood at the edge, hat in hand, head bowed. Turner beside him looked pale, coughing blood into the snow. Harlan pretended not to notice. Later that day, Harlan was called to assist a patrol scouting the eastern woods. Turner wanted to come, but the medic forbade it. You move, you bleed out, he warned. Turner relented, staying behind to guard the line. The patrol crept through the forest near Recogny, where German lines lay barely a mile away. The silence was oppressive. Dead men lay half buried under snow, faces expressionless. They reached a ridge overlooking a frozen field. In the distance, trucks idled, enemy supply convoy. Harlan raised his binoculars, noting positions, counting guns. Suddenly, a flare burst overhead, green light bathing the trees. "Ambush!" someone shouted. Machine gun fire ripped through the patrol. Men dropped instantly. Harlan dove behind a log, returning fire. The forest exploded with chaos. Bullets tore bark above his head. He crawled through the snow, dragging a wounded man by his collar. The man screamed once, then went limp. The firefight raged for minutes that felt like hours. Finally, American artillery responded, shells landing among the Germans and scattering them. Harlan staggered back toward the lines with the survivors. His coat was torn, his ears ringing. Bastonia's church spire came into view through the haze like a miracle. When he reached their dugout, Turner was waiting. "You're late," he said, trying to smile. "The road was busy," Harlan replied. They shared a cigarette in silence. Around them, men slept sitting up, rifles still in hand. Somewhere in the dark, someone played a harmonica, a slow, haunting tune that drifted through the cold air. Christmas night came quietly. The shelling ceased for a few hours, as if even war needed to breathe. Turner spoke softly, voice rasping. "When this is over, I'm going home to Kentucky. Gonna build a house near the river. You?" Harlan exhaled a cloud of smoke. "London. My wife's waiting. You think she still believes you're alive?" "I hope so," Harlan said. "If not, I'll knock twice." Turner chuckled, then coughed. Harlan glanced at him, too pale, too weak. The infection in his arm had spread. Without medicine, it was only a matter of time. Before dawn, the bombardment resumed. German artillery pounded Bastonia from every direction. Buildings collapsed. Fires spread through the town. The men clung to their foxholes as the sky lit up red. Amid the chaos, a messenger stumbled through the trenches, shouting, "Patton's coming! Third Army's breaking through!" The words spread like wildfire. Hope returned to the frozen faces of the defenders. Harlan grinned despite the noise. "You hear that?" Turner nodded faintly. "Told you we'd make it." Hours later, the rumble of engines grew louder, not enemy, but friendly. American tanks of Patton's 4th Armored Division burst through the southern road, guns blazing. Cheers erupted all along the line. Bastonia had been relieved. Turner slumped back against the trench wall, eyes closed, smiling. "Guess the cavalry really does show up." Harlan clasped his shoulder. "You did it, lad." You held on. Snow fell thicker now, soft and endless. The siege was broken, but the Ardennes still burned. For Harlan and Turner, survival had become more than duty. It was defiance. The morning came like a whisper. Pale, thin, almost unsure. The snow had stopped. The forest was still. Only the creak of frozen branches and the low hum of distant artillery, reminding them that war still lived beyond the horizon. Walker's fever had broken during the night. Finch had held him close to the small fire, shielding the embers' light beneath his greatcoat. They hadn't spoken much. Words cost warmth. But as the dawn stretched its faint blue light across the hollow, Finch's hand shook Walker's shoulder gently. "Time to move, mate. We'll freeze before the Krauts find us." Walker's eyes opened slowly, bloodshot and hollow. "If they find us, it'll be quick. Or we'll find our boys," Finch said. "One or the other." They gathered what little remained: 2 clips, a bayonet, a German blanket, and half a canteen of ice. The wind carried the sound of engines now, faint but certain, echoing down from the valley. They moved toward it, creeping through the blackened trees, every step a prayer against the crunch of snow. At the edge of the tree line, the world opened to the valley below. the outskirts of Bastogne, ringed with smoke and fire. From this height they could see flickers of tracer rounds cutting through the fog, small flares bursting like dying stars. "There," Finch whispered. "Our lines. Look at the flares." Walker squinted. "Or theirs." "Can't tell from here." A shell burst somewhere near the southern edge, the shockwave rolling up the hill like thunder. Both men hit the ground, hearts hammering. "That's artillery from our side," Walker said, breathless. "Those are our boys." Finch looked at him, teeth chattering. "Then let's go home." They began the descent, slow and deliberate. A German patrol moved through the lower woods, 6 men, white camo, rifles ready. Walker spotted them first and pushed Finch down behind a log. "2 rifles between us," Finch muttered, "and they've got 6. Walker's eyes darted toward the far slope. "We go around." But the Germans had stopped. One of them knelt beside a dead paratrooper. An American. He lifted the man's dog tag, murmured something, then pocketed it. Another soldier pointed toward the higher ridge, right where Walker and Finch hid. "Scheisse!" Finch whispered. The first burst of rifle fire split the air. Snow exploded around them as bullets tore through branches. They ran, stumbling, falling, sliding through ice and mud, their breath ragged. Finch fired blindly over his shoulder, 2 rounds cracking into the white fog. "Keep moving," Walker shouted. "Don't stop." They burst through a frozen ditch, tumbling hard. Finch's helmet flew off, rolling into the snow. Walker grabbed him by the collar, dragging him behind a small ridge as machine gun fire rattled above them. "I'm hit," Finch gasped, pressing his hand to his side. Walker looked. Blood seeped between the man's fingers, dark and heavy. "Not bad," Walker said, lying through his teeth. "We patch it up and keep going." Finch laughed weakly. "You're a terrible liar, Yank." "Yeah, well, you Brits don't smile enough anyway." Another volley sliced the air. Walker returned fire. 2 short bursts. One German fell, then another. The rest hesitated, shouting in the fog. Then came the sound they both prayed for, the deep thrum of an Allied tank engine rumbling close. Finch blinked through the snow. "Tell me that's not a Tiger." Walker shook his head, a grin breaking through his exhaustion. "No, that's a Sherman. M4. Listen to that baby purr." Moments later, the tank's turret appeared from the tree line, its white star smeared with mud. American infantry followed, shouting orders, rifles at the ready. The Germans melted into the woods as the Sherman's main gun roared once, silencing the ridge. Walker dropped his weapon and raised his arms. "Friendly, friendly. Corporal Walker, 327th Glider Infantry. Don't shoot." The squad approached cautiously. One of the soldiers, face wrapped in a scarf, lowered his M1. "Jesus Christ, you 2 look like hell." "Been worse," Walker muttered, helping Finch up. "We're from Manhay. Convoy got cut off. Been walking since the 22nd. The sergeant, leading the patrol, blinked. "You walked through German lines?" "Mostly crawled," Finch wheezed. "Got a bit of sightseeing in Huffalize on the way." They laughed, short, brittle laughs that felt foreign after so many days of silence. The sergeant called in the radio operator, who confirmed their story. Within minutes, medics had Finch on a stretcher, wrapping his wound tight. Walker stood beside him as they loaded him onto a truck bound for Bastogne. Finch caught his sleeve weakly. "You tell him, Yank. Tell him the Brits made it out first, yeah?" Walker grinned. "Sure thing, Corporal. I'll make it a legend." Finch's smile lingered, even as his eyes closed. They reached Bastogne by nightfall. The town was still under siege, but inside the lines it felt like another world. Fires burning in barrels, soldiers laughing softly over tin cups of coffee, the smell of fuel and cordite thick in the air. Walker sat on a crate outside the aid station, his rifle leaning beside him, snowflakes melting on his helmet. The medics worked on Finch inside. Through the canvas flap, he could hear voices, quick and urgent, then quieter. When a young nurse finally stepped out, she looked at him for a long moment before shaking her head. Walker nodded once, staring into the snow. No words came. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the scrap of paper Finch had kept, a torn bit of a field map marked with a single pencil line tracing their journey, Manhay to Bertogne to Uffalise to Bastogne. Beneath it, Finch had written in shaky handwriting, "If lost, keep walking east. The world's still turning." Walker folded it carefully and tucked it into his jacket. Then he stood, looked once more at the white horizon, and whispered, "Safe travels, Corporal." Weeks later, when Bastogne was relieved and the snow began to melt, Walker was reassigned north with the 101st. The story of the two lost corporals spread through the ranks like folklore. Two ghosts who had crossed the Ardennes, fought through German patrols, and found their way home. In the ruins of La Roche-en-Ardennes, Walker found a quiet hill and placed a small wooden cross, no name, no regiment, just a helmet resting atop it. Above him, the clouds parted, and for a brief moment, sunlight broke across the valley. The war in Europe is ending, but not for everyone. Across the frozen fields of France, small groups of Allied soldiers wander behind enemy lines, lost, cut off, forgotten. 6 men, Americans, and 1 Polish corporal survived an ambush near the Marne. Their jeep was destroyed, their maps gone, their rations spent. Only instinct and faith keep them moving. Each carries more than a rifle. Keller from Indiana, who once worked a farm not unlike these fields. Donovan, the joker from Kansas, now silent. Reese from Ohio's steel mills. Daly from Pennsylvania's coal towns. Thomas from Alabama's cotton roads, and Piotr Nowak, a refugee of Warsaw's ruins. They are not heroes, not yet. Just tired men walking through enemy land, praying for a miracle. When the soldiers first spotted the crooked roof of Jean Morel's farmhouse, the sun hung low over the French countryside, painting the wheat fields in a blinding gold. For days, the men had walked in silence, 6 exhausted soldiers, ghosts of an army retreating from disaster. Their boots were caked in mud, uniforms torn, faces hollowed by cold and hunger. They followed Piotr Nowak, the Polish corporal, whose calm eyes never stopped scanning the horizon. Every step was deliberate, every sound a risk. The memory of the ambush near the Marne still burned in their minds, the gunfire, the screams, the explosion that had left their jeep smoldering and their supplies gone. They had survived, barely. Now, survival meant silence. Keller was the first to spot the house. "There," he whispered, pointing through the tall wheat. The others followed his gaze. A crooked roof, a leaning chimney, walls that seemed too thin to withstand the wind. "Looks empty," Keller said. Donovan shook his head. "Empty or not, it's too perfect. No smoke, no movement. That's the kind of perfect that gets you killed." But there was no other shelter in sight. The men crouched, studying the house as the sun dipped behind the hills. Finally, Piotr gave the order. "We move." Quietly, they crossed the field in a crouch, rifles ready, nerves tight as wire. When they reached the porch, Keller lifted a hand to knock, but before his knuckles met the wood, the door creaked open. Jean Morel stood there, thin, gray-haired, eyes sharp and unreadable. He didn't flinch at the sight of their uniforms. He didn't ask who they were. He simply said in a low, steady voice, "Quickly, before the ghosts find you inside." The air smelled of dust, old wine, and wood smoke. The kitchen was small, cluttered with tools, bottles, and memories. Jean moved with quiet precision, his every step practiced, purposeful. He pointed to a worn rug near the table. Beneath it, a trap door. Keller lifted it carefully. A cold breath of earth rose from the darkness. One by one, the men descended. Keller, Reese, Thomas, Daly, Donovan, and finally Piotr. The last thing they saw before the hatch closed was Julian's face, pale in the lamplight, eyes filled with something like defiance. Below, the cellar was cramped with earth walls, crates of potatoes, and the faint smell of dampness. The lantern flickered, casting trembling shadows across their faces. Every sound from above made their hearts seize, then silence, until it came. A dog's bark, boots on gravel, the low growl of an engine, a German patrol. Above them, Jane moved calmly. The men could hear his footsteps, slow and deliberate. One of the Germans called out sharply, "Old man, you're alone here?" Jean's voice replied, quiet but steady. "Yes, just me and the dust." The soldiers in the cellar held their breath. One of the Germans poked at the floorboards with a bayonet. The blade scraped dangerously close to the trap door. Another led his dog across the rug. Thomas's breathing came too fast. Piotr's hand shot out, gripping his shoulder. "Do not move," he whispered. "Do not breathe." The dog whined. The German sergeant cursed under his breath. Minutes stretched into eternity. Then a door slammed. Footsteps retreated. Engines rumbled, fading into the night. Silence again. A silence thick enough to break the strongest man. After what felt like hours, Donovan whispered, "I thought that dog had us for sure." Keller exhaled, trembling. "That man, he's made of something we'll never understand." Jean's voice came softly from above. "No courage," he said, "just stubbornness. Sometimes that is enough." The night deepened, and beneath the crooked farmhouse, 7 men waited alive, unseen and unsure what tomorrow would bring. The dawn came quietly. Pink and gold lights spilled across the wheat fields, brushing away the shadows of night. Inside the crooked farmhouse, the cellar door creaked open. Jean Morel's face appeared in the faint light, weary but alive. "Come," he whispered. "They are gone." The soldiers climbed out, stiff and trembling, blinking against the early sunlight. Outside, the air was cold and clean. For the first time in days, they could breathe without fear of being discovered. Keller looked toward the horizon. "How far to safety?" he asked. Jean shrugged. "Farther than your legs will like," he said, "but close enough if you keep your heads down." They packed quickly what little they had left. Donovan carried his revolver. Piotr checked the compass. Jean took only a walking stick and a loaf of bread. Then they began to move. The fields glowed under the morning sun. Wheat whispered around their knees as they walked in a single file. John led the way, each step chosen carefully. Every sound, every rustle could mean discovery. Keller muttered, "Feels like walking through gold," Piotr replied quietly. "Gold gets men killed." They kept going. Over low hills, through shallow streams, into thickets that clawed at their clothes. When they reached a narrow creek, Jean pointed to the rocks. "Step only there," he said. "No footprints." The Germans read the ground better than books. They crossed one by one, balancing and silencing their only friends. By midday, the sun burned high above them. Hunger gnawed, but no one spoke of it. The road to Épernay was long too exposed, so Jean guided them through the back ways, paths only farmers and foxes knew. Now and then they saw signs of war, a burned truck, a dead horse, a child's doll lying in the dirt. The world felt hollowed out, emptied of its joy. They stopped under an oak tree to rest. Reese leaned back, sighing, "If I make it out of this, I'm never leaving Ohio again." Daly chuckled softly. "You'll miss the coal mines before the week's over." Even Piotr smiled faintly. "Home," he said. "We all talk about it like it's still there." For a brief moment, they weren't soldiers. They were just men remembering the smell of bread, the sound of their mothers calling them in from the fields, the laughter of people who hadn't yet vanished into history. But peace never lasted long. A faint hum rolled across the sky. Pyotr's head snapped up. "Plane," he said. The others froze. The sound grew louder, a low, mechanical growl that made the air tremble. "Recon," Jean said sharply. "Down! Into the wheat!" They dropped, pressing themselves into the golden stalks. The earth was cool and damp against their faces. Above them, the German reconnaissance plane swept across the sky, slow and searching. No one breathed. Not a word, not a motion. The drone passed overhead once, twice before finally fading into the east. Only then did they rise, dirt clinging to their clothes, hearts pounding like drums. Keller wiped his face. "That was too close." Jane didn't answer. He simply kept walking. By evening, the lights softened again, orange and blue across the horizon. They reached the edge of the forest. In the distance stood an old barn, half collapsed, forgotten by time. Jean stopped. "We will rest there tonight." Inside, the barn smelled of hay and rust. Broken crates and old tools lay scattered across the floor. They settled into the shadows, each man finding his corner. Daly whispered, "Think the old man ever sleeps?" Donovan chuckled quietly. "Not while we're still breathing." Jean looked at them, a small smile flickering across his face. "You will not see me here tonight," he said. "If the Germans come, they cannot find me in the house that does not exist." "What do you mean?" Thomas asked. Jean simply replied, "It means I must leave before you do." They understood then his safety was gone the moment he helped them. He was risking everything, his home, his life, his family name. The night fell heavy. Crickets sang outside. The wind whispered through the wheat. And for the first time in weeks, the men slept without dreams. When the dawn came again, Jean was gone. Only a loaf of bread and a note remained on the floor. "Follow the stream north. Trust the forest. Do not look back." The men read it in silence. Then Piotr folded the paper and slipped it into his coat. "Let's move," he said quietly. "We owe the farmer that much." They stepped out into the golden light, the barn shrinking behind them, a relic of safety in a world that had forgotten mercy. The morning after John's disappearance, the 6 soldiers followed his note north. The forest closed around them, a cathedral of tall trees and echoing silence. Sunlight flickered through the branches, dancing across their faces. Every step was guided by faith in a man they barely knew, a man whose courage had already saved their lives. For hours they moved in silence. Sometimes they heard voices distant, muffled German, maybe French. Once they saw smoke from a village curling thinly into the gray sky. Each time Piotr raised his hand, signaling them to stop. Each time they froze, waited, and moved again when it was safe. They were learning to survive like ghosts. By midday, the forest began to thin. They reached a stone bridge, old, cracked, half covered in moss. Beyond it lay vineyards stretching to the horizon. Jean had been right. The land near Epernay was still alive, wounded but breathing. Reese stopped, catching his breath. "We're close," he said. "I can feel it." Keller nodded, scanning the distance. "Or maybe we just want to believe we are." They crossed the bridge carefully, one at a time. At the far end, hidden behind a wall of ivy, a door stood ajar. A hand reached out from the shadows, a man in a worn resistance coat. "Vous êtes les Américains?" the whispered. Piotr nodded. "Yes." "Jean Morel sent us?" The man's eyes softened. "Then you are safe now. Come quickly inside." The safe house smelled of coffee and candle wax. Maps covered the walls, and a small radio crackled faintly in the corner. A woman brought bread and water. For the first time in days, the men ate without fear. Daly leaned back, eyes closed. "We made it," he whispered. Donovan grinned faintly. "No, he made it happen." They wanted to thank Jean, to see him again, shake his hand, maybe tell him that his stupid little house had become a miracle. But Jean Morel was already back in his fields, alone. Weeks passed. The war turned, then ended. Across Europe, bells rang and flags waved. Soldiers returned home to parades, medals, and music. But in a small corner of France, Jean Morel quietly repaired his roof. He mended fences, fed his cows, replanted vines in the soil burned by war. When people asked about the soldiers, he only said, "They were good men. They went home." He never mentioned the Germans, or the night the dog sniffed the trap door, or how close death had come. He simply lived, stubbornly, quietly, honorably. The world moved on. Keller went back to Indiana, where the fields reminded him of that golden French wheat. Donovan returned to Kansas, raising two sons who would never know how close their father had come to disappearing. Reese found work in an Ohio mill, Daly in the coal mines of Pennsylvania, Thomas in the cotton towns of Alabama, and Piotr returned to Poland, where another struggle awaited, but he carried Jean's note with him until the day he died. Years later, historians wrote about that winter, the battles, the generals, the grand strategies. Jean Morel's name appeared only once in a footnote, a local farmer who aided Allied troops during the Ardennes campaign. No medal, no monument, just a name almost lost to time. But for 6 men who had hidden beneath his floorboards, he was more than history. He was proof that courage doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it opens a door and says, "Quickly, before the ghosts find you." In the summer of 1945, the crooked farmhouse still stood patched roof, uneven walls, vines creeping along the stone. The locals called it La Petite Maison Stupide du Fermier, the farmer's stupid little house, but those who knew better smiled when they heard the name, because inside that stupid little house, 7 men had found life when all else seemed lost, because one quiet farmer had chosen kindness over safety, and because, in the darkest of times, that house became a beacon not of power but of heart. History often forgets its quiet heroes, but some stories remain carried not by books but by memory, by gratitude, by the simple truth that humanity endures, and that, perhaps, is the story worth telling. It was 1943 in a quiet village in Bavaria, Germany. The sun cast a golden glow over wheat fields, and at first glance, life seemed untouched by war. Children played in the streets, farmers tended their fields, and smoke rose from chimneys. But beneath the calm, the war was everywhere. Hans Bauer, a farmer in his early 40s, knew this well. He had served briefly in the Wehrmacht and returned home after witnessing the Eastern Front's horrors. He had seen friends die, neighbors disappear, and the brutality of the regime. Returning home, he sought peace, but peace was hard to find in a country gripped by fear. One evening, as Hans checked his barn, he heard soft cries. At first he thought it was an animal, but then a young man stumbled into view, bleeding and shivering. His uniform was torn, his eyes wide with terror. Hans moved instinctively, lifting him into the barn. "You're safe here," Hans whispered. The man, barely 20, introduced himself as James Whitman, an American pilot who had escaped capture. Hans realized the danger immediately. Hiding one Allied soldier could mean death if discovered, but doing nothing was impossible. Over the next days, Hans helped James recover, providing food, water, and warmth. He knew more would follow. Word of a safe place in Bavaria would reach other soldiers, and soon he would face a choice: turn them away or risk everything to save them. He decided to act. Hans converted his barn into a sanctuary. Hidden compartments beneath floorboards, false walls, secret nooks behind hay bales. Every inch was a potential hiding place. Food and water were carefully rationed, and he studied patrol routes, learning when the village was safe. The first real test came when German soldiers arrived unexpectedly. They knocked on the barn door, inspected the surroundings, and asked questions. Hans stayed calm. "I live alone," he said, "just feeding the animals." Hours passed. Officers circled the barn, suspicious but convinced by Hans's calmness. When they left, the soldiers hiding beneath floorboards exhaled, hearts pounding. Hans knew then that every successful night was a small victory. Every mistake could be fatal. By the end of the year, more soldiers arrived, Americans, British, Canadians. Each was guided to hidden spaces, learning the rules of silence, patience, and survival. Hans became their quiet protector, an ordinary man performing extraordinary deeds, risking everything for strangers. And so it began. The quiet heroism of one man hidden in plain sight, saving lives in a world of fear, without recognition, without glory, only courage. By 1944, Hans Bauer's barn had become a secret refuge for dozens of Allied soldiers. Word spread quietly through resistance networks. A German farmer, quiet and unassuming, was offering sanctuary. Young men from America, Britain, Canada, and other Allied nations arrived, weary, hungry, and terrified. Hans worked meticulously. Each day he checked the hidden compartments, floorboards, and false walls. He rationed food carefully, stored water in hidden barrels, and folded blankets into secret nooks. Every arrival added risk. Every night he listened for patrols, footsteps on gravel, barking dogs, or the distant hum of a German truck. One wrong sound could expose him and the men he protected. The soldiers learned quickly. Silence became a language. Whispers were measured. Even a cough or a creak had to be controlled. Nights were the hardest. Men pressed together in hidden spaces, hearts pounding, listening as danger crept close. One winter night, a German officer arrived inspecting barns in the village. Hans greeted him calmly, offering bread and discussing livestock, hiding dozens of soldiers mere feet away. Hours passed, tension stretching time itself. Finally, the officer left, muttering about paperwork, and life continued, but only just. Hans also guided soldiers along secret paths. He led small groups through forests, across frozen rivers, and past patrols, helping them reach safe houses or cross borders into Switzerland. Each escape was a careful choreography of movement, silence, and trust. One misstep, one wrong word, could cost lives. Despite the danger, Hans never faltered. He taught the men patience and courage. He became a shadow in the village, ordinary on the surface, extraordinary in action. By the end of 1944, nearly 200 soldiers had passed through Hans's barn. Some stayed days, some weeks, but all carried away stories of courage and hope. His barn was more than wood and hay. It was a symbol of humanity in a world dominated by fear. And still, Hans remained quiet, returning to his fields each day, tending livestock, repairing his barn, hiding lives in plain sight. He risked everything for strangers, and through his courage, hundreds survived. By early 1945, the war was entering its final months. Across Germany, towns lay in ruins. Families were displaced, cities bombed, and the Reich's authority had crumbled. Yet in a small Bavarian village, one barn remained quietly standing, a simple structure, ordinary to anyone passing by, but extraordinary within. Hans Bauer, the farmer, had sheltered nearly 200 Allied soldiers. Men from America, Britain, Canada, and beyond had found sanctuary beneath his floorboards, behind false walls, and in secret compartments. They were soldiers who had seen death close, who had survived ambushes, bombings, and the horrors of frontline combat. For each, Hans had been the difference between life and death. As Allied forces pushed deeper into Germany, the risk of patrols diminished. Yet Hans still felt the weight of his decisions. He remembered the nights when soldiers pressed flat against walls, silent, breath held, hearts hammering as German boots moved overhead. He remembered the first man, James Whitman, the young American pilot who had stumbled into his barn and every single soldier who had followed. When the war officially ended in May 1945, Hans did not celebrate. There were no parades for him, no medals pinned to his chest, no ceremonies in the village square. To his neighbors, he was still the quiet farmer who repaired his barn, tended his animals, and worked the fields. Yet the men he had saved carried his story in their hearts. Letters and visits began to arrive. Years later, James Whitman returned to the United States and told his family, friends, and fellow veterans about the German farmer who had risked everything to save his life. Lieutenant Richard Moore, a Canadian officer, shared Hans's story in reunions, meetings of veterans groups, and private letters. A British sergeant who had spent weeks hidden in the barn's false walls wrote decades later about the courage of an ordinary man who had made the extraordinary choice to protect strangers. But the story did not end there. Decades later, journalists, historians, and even some surviving soldiers sought Hans Bauer. Some wanted to thank him. Others wanted to study the remarkable logistics of hiding so many men in a small barn without detection. One historian traveled through Bavaria, knocking on doors, following old maps and wartime letters, asking neighbors if they remembered a man who had quietly saved lives. Some villagers had vague recollections, a man with a quiet smile, always working the fields, rarely speaking of the war. But Hans had always kept his secret. Yet, despite the searches, Hans remained elusive. Even as stories spread across continents, he continued to live simply. He repaired his barn, planted wheat in fields, cared for his cows, and tended his small orchard. He lived quietly, a man whose extraordinary acts had gone unnoticed in the wider world, but which had saved hundreds. In later interviews with surviving soldiers, many recalled the fear of being discovered. They spoke of nights pressed against wooden walls, listening to every creak and whisper, and of the calm presence of Hans Bauer in the barn above them, moving with confidence and silence, seemingly unaware of danger, yet entirely aware of it. "He made us believe we could survive," one soldier said decades later. "And in truth, he gave us more than that. He gave us hope." Hans often reflected on the risks he had taken. He remembered the patrols that came too close, the nights when a single mistake could have cost lives, the moments when courage was measured not by action but by restraint and silence. He understood that heroism is not always loud, it does not always come with medals or recognition. Sometimes it is simply a choice, to do the right thing when the world seems indifferent, to act when no one will ever know. By the 1960s, people still sought him. Veterans tried to trace him using old letters and wartime maps. Journalists asked neighbors for any leads. Some believed Hans might have perished. Others thought he had moved. But he remained in his village, tending the same fields, repairing the same barn, living the same quiet life. Even in his old age, Hans received visitors who had tracked him down. Some were soldiers he had saved, now elderly themselves, filled with gratitude and awe. They would sit with him in the barn, the same barn that had once been a fortress of survival, and speak in whispers of the nights they spent hidden, of the fear, the silence, and the courage that sustained them. Hans would smile quietly, brush off their praise, and say simply, "I did what anyone should have done. It was nothing extraordinary, just the right thing." Yet for those who had survived because of him, and for historians who later studied his actions, it was extraordinary. A single man, living quietly in the Bavarian countryside, had created a sanctuary in the shadow of war. He had defied fear, authority, and the machinery of a violent regime. He had transformed a simple barn into a lifeline for hundreds, and he had done it silently, without fame or recognition. Hans Bauer passed away quietly in his village, surrounded by fields that had long since returned to peace. But his story lived on. Veterans told their children, historians documented his courage, and the barn itself became a symbol, a reminder that ordinary humans can perform extraordinary acts when the world demands it. And perhaps the greatest lesson of all is that heroism doesn't need witnesses. It does not need applause. It can exist quietly and visibly in the choices of one ordinary person whose courage and humanity ripple across decades, touching hundreds of lives and leaving an enduring legacy that even history can scarcely contain. The quiet heroism of Hans Bauer reminds us that in the darkest times there are still people who choose hope over fear, life over death, and humanity over indifference. That is the legacy he leaves, and it is the story worth telling.